Hey everyone, and welcome to the next video of my Express tutorial series. We're going to be talking about how to add persistence to our Express application by connecting it to a MySQL database. Specifically, we'll be storing user credentials, so username and password, that were filled out in a login and sign-up form. And we will do this by using a popular ORM called Sequelize. We'll also go over what Sequelize and MySQL are. And I also just want to mention that all the code for this video, as well as a blog format, can be found on my website, where I provide the link in the description. But to begin, so what is persistence? Well, in programming, persistence means saving data for future use, and this is typically done with a database. And a database is simply a collection of structured data. A common example of persistence in an application is saving user information, such as username and password, when a user creates an account. When the user visits the application and logs in, we compare the provided login credentials to the ones stored in the database. And so to connect to a database with our Express application, we are going to be using Sequelize. And all this is an npm package, so let's install it with npm install Sequelize. And so let me also go over what Sequelize is. So Sequelize is a promise-based object relational mapper, or ORM, library. And essentially, Sequelize allows us to write SQL queries with JavaScript, which is great because Express is in JavaScript or Node, and then, of course, it makes it easier to also write our SQL queries in the same language. And I've also been using the term ORM, or Object Relational Mapper, a lot. So what really is an ORM? Well, ORM is a technique that allows us to query and manipulate data from a database in an object-oriented way. And in ORM, the object is the object we will create with JavaScript, relational is the RDBMS that we will use, for us this is MySQL, and mapper is the bridge between our JavaScript objects and MySQL tables. And so as stated earlier, we're also going to be using Sequelize to connect our Express application to a MySQL database. Well, what is MySQL? Well, MySQL is a Relational Database Management System, or RDBMS. And an RDBMS is a type of database management system that stores data in rows in tables. And these tables often have relationships with each other. For example, our application could have a users table and a post table. And a relationship between these tables could be that a user owns a post, as say they wrote it. And now to use MySQL with Sequelize, we need to install the MySQL driver. And the MySQL driver is an npm package called MySQL2. So we'll do npm install MySQL2. And let me also show you how using npm install will add this to our package.json dependencies. So we can see Sequelize, and we can also see our MySQL driver here. And now to start storing information, we need to create a database. And we will create a database using MySQL Workbench. And if MySQL Workbench, or MySQL for that fact, are not installed on your system, they can be installed by watching a video that I'll post in the description, or with a link that I'll post in the description. But for this video, we're going to be using MySQL Workbench to interact with MySQL, which I have installed here. And if you don't have it installed, follow the link in the description to get it installed. And so now, what is MySQL Workbench? Well, MySQL Workbench is a GUI for working with MySQL. So instead of using the command line, we just get a nice interface here. And MySQL Workbench integrates database design, creation, maintenance, basically everything you can do, into an easy-to-use GUI. So essentially, MySQL Workbench is a GUI for the MySQL server. And so what we're going to do is we're going to click on one of these connections that we've created, which you will do in a video in the description, or that link that takes to that video. You'll get all this set up. But so before we begin storing data from our application, we need to first create a database. And we will do this with MySQL Workbench. And to create a database, we click on this button here, which is Create Schema. And so a schema in MySQL is synonymous to a database, essentially. But so when prompted, we're going to name this schema MyExpressApp, and then press Next until we get to the end. So we're going to name it MyExpressApp, and then apply. And then just apply, close. And now before we connect to this schema or database that we made, let's create a configuration folder and place a file called dbconfig inside. And so this configuration folder will hold all of our configuration. And will hold all of our configuration files. And one of these files, dbconfig.js, will contain all the configuration information for connecting to our database. So let's create all these constants that we're going to need. But so specifically, these variables that we've created here will be passed to Sequelize to form a connection to our database. And note that the user and password values of this exported object might be different depending on how you set up MySQL. So in that video I sent how to set up MySQL and MySQL Workbench, you should be using the username and password that you configured here. And also notice how the database name, MyExpressApp, corresponds to this schema that we made in MySQL Workbench, so MyExpressApp. And now let's go back into our Express project, and now the creation of our database connection and MySQL tables will all be done inside a folder called Models. So let's create a top-level folder called Models. And so this Models folder will hold our database connection and MySQL tables. And if you're wondering why I called it Models, let's talk about what a model is. Well, a model is a Sequelize term that represents a table in our database. For example, if we have a users table in our database, we can represent it with a Sequelize model called users. And whatever changes we make to our Sequelize model will be reflected in our MySQL table. And now let's add two files to our models folder, index.js and users.js. So this index.js file will instantiate our database connection, and this user.js file will house our user model. But now let's connect to the database we made inside MySQL Workbench. And to do this, let's import Sequelize and our database configuration file into our model-index.js. And so to connect to our database with Sequelize, we first need to create an instance of Sequelize and then provide it some information about our database. So to our Sequelize constructor, and you can see it's a constructor because we're using this new keyword here, what we do is we first pass the name of our database. And this is the name, MyExpressApp, that we gave our database when creating it with MySQL Workbench. Next, we provide Sequelize the username and password to access our database. These will be the username and password that were configured when setting up MySQL, so username and password. We then pass Sequelize the hostname of the database. And as this database is on our local machine, the hostname is simply localhost. And finally, as this is a MySQL database, we need to let Sequelize know by providing it the MySQL as the dialect. And if we go back into our, which file was it, dbconfig, we can see our dialect is MySQL. And now we want this database connection to be accessible to the rest of our application whenever we need to work with it. And as such, we want to export our Sequelize instance, and we will export an object called db from this file. So let's attach our Sequelize instance to it. And we also want to export each Sequelize model we create. And remember, a model is a representation of a MySQL table. For example, this table, or this application, will have a table of all the registered users. So let's also export that. So the file user.js will represent our user table, and it will export a function that takes two arguments, our Sequelize instance and Sequelize data types. And these data types will be used to set the data type of our user model columns. So you'll see more of this soon, but now let's export this DB object that we made. So now let's work on creating our Sequelize user model. So let's go into user.js. And this model will hold the data for our registered users. And we will create this model inside this model-user.js file, and this file will export a function that returns our user model. So remember, this Sequelize and data types will come in from here when we require this user file, which gives us the function, and then we pass in our Sequelize instance and also Sequelize data types. So let's go back in here. And let's use the passed in Sequelize instance to create our model. And we can create a model with Sequelize using the method define. And so the first argument supplied to Sequelize.define is the name of the model. And we want to name our model user. The next argument is an object that describes the columns in our model, So this, right now we just have an empty object. And the third argument is an object that can be used to customize our model even further. But so let's give our Sequelize model some columns. And in our user model, we want 2 columns. We want username and we also want password. And we also want each of these columns to be strings. So we pass an object as the second argument to Sequelize.define, where each property of this object is a column. Specifically, the key is the name of the column, and the value is the data type that the column will be. For example, if we also wanted to have an age column, what we could do is we would add age, and then data types dot integer. But we only want 2 columns, which we want password, or username, which will be a string, and password, which will be a string. And now something Sequelize does automatically is pluralize the model name we provided. For example, the name user that we provided here will be transformed to users when we look at it in MySQL or MySQL Workbench. And if we don't want this to happen, we can customize our model by supplying properties to the third object argument. So the property freeze table name, when set to true, will tell Sequelize not to pluralize our model name. And now the last thing we need to do is return this Sequelize model. So we'll do return user, which is essentially the table. And then what we do, so we've created user, it returns this user table, and then we attach it to our DB object under models. And so now let's sync Sequelize with MySQL. So we've connected our Express application to our database, and we've created a Sequelize model. Now we need to tell MySQL to create a table in our database using this Sequelize model. And we want to do this inside our main index.js file. So first, let's go over to our main index.js file here, and let's import our Sequelize instance. So remember, this is the DB object that we exported from models-index.js. And attached to this object is our Sequelize instance and all the models that were created. And now, to sync up our Sequelize models with MySQL, we need to use Sequelize.sync. And this is an asynchronous method. So what we're going to do is wrap it with an async IIFE so we can use the await keyword. So down here, let's do it right here. And real quick, what is an IIFE? Well, an IIFE, or immediately invoked function expression, is a JavaScript function that runs when it is defined. So this will basically define this function and then run it. And IIFEs are often used to avoid polluting the global namespace. So now all we need to do is run our application. And I actually need to switch my Node version to a different one, but I believe it's been a while since I've looked at this. I'm trying to remember if we have a script. No. So what we're just running is nodemon index.js, I believe. And we can see I got a Sequelize access denied error. So I must have gotten the password wrong. So I need to figure out what that actually is. And so I remember what my password was. So now we're good to go. So we can see right off the bat that what this does here, this sync method, this is actually going to run some MySQL code. And we can see the code here. Create table if not exists user. We can see some columns it's making, an ID, our username that we supplied, password that we supplied, and then some other ones that we'll get into what they are in a second. But now if we go into MySQL Workbench, and I think I might need to refresh this. If we open up tables, we can see our user table right here. And even more, we can see the columns, and we can see username, password. So now let's talk about these extra columns in our MySQL table. So when inspecting this column right here, there are 3 columns present that we did not make, and these are ID, CreatedAt, and UpdatedAt. And the ID column will be the primary key of our table. We can create our own primary key column, but it is simpler to let Sequelize do this for us for this example. And this default primary key is an integer that will increment by 1 with each new row. Really quick, if you don't know what a primary key is essentially a special column in a relational database that uniquely identifies each row in a table. So can't possibly be two same IDs in a column, essentially, if it's the primary key. And now let's talk about this CreatedAt and UpdatedAt columns. So the CreatedAt column lists the time a row was added to the table, and the UpdatedAt column lists the time a row was most recently updated. And we can also choose to not have the CreatedAt and UpdatedAt columns by customizing our Sequelize model. So if you remember, where was it? In here where we added freeze table name, we can also add like timestamps false or something if we don't want those in, but there's also no harm in having those there. And now something real quick I want to mention is that this application we're building is an MVC design. And so what this means is we're setting up our application with a model view controller design pattern. So I'll go over this more in a sec, but for now, let's create a folder called controllers and add a file, user.js and an index.js file. And so what is an MVC? Well, model view controller, or MVC, is a software design pattern that separates the program into three parts: the model, the view, and the controller. And the model is the part that works with the data. The view is the part that works with the UI, and the controller is the interface between the model and view that manipulates the data and also interacts with the UI. And in this framework, the model is our Sequelize models, the view is our Pug templates, and the controller is what we're about to make now. So let's create our user controller. So the controller file user.js is going to be responsible for anything related to users in our database. For example, removing a user from the database would be performed by our user controller. So at adding a user, updating a user, and everything like that. And as our user.js controller interacts with our user database, we need to import our Sequelize model, or our Sequelize user model. So essentially what this does is, let me also go back into, our models index.js. We are essentially obtaining this here, du.models.user, by using some kind of complicated destructuring. I wouldn't recommend doing this because I think it looks messy, but for now I'm just gonna leave it like this. But so now we have our user model, and what we're gonna do with this file is export an object containing all our controller functions. And as of now, we're just going to be creating a method to add users to our database. So now you might be wondering where this request and response comes from in this function. Well, the request and response objects that this method takes will come from a post call to our -login route. And when a user submits the login form, the login post route will be called, and we will pass this function as middleware to the route. And as the request will be a post request, we know that the data will be inside the request's body. So let's first check if the username and password were filled out. And so if both the username and password are present, then we want to add that user to our database. And we want to do this with the Sequelize model create method. So this Sequelize create method, what it does is adds a row to our table in our database. And this create method is asynchronous, so we need to wait for it to finish. And after the user has been added to the database, we want to render their profile page and pass it their username. And I believe we have the pug file called profile. Excellent. So we have profile and it takes username, if you remember that from a previous video. And now on the other hand, if the username and password were not entered or not present in the request, let's just send a message to the client saying not added to the database. And now let's add our user controller to our controllers index.js file. So this isn't necessary as we can directly import our user.js file, of course, but in this case, we will use index.js to keep track of all our controllers at once. So let's place the following inside this index.js file. And now let's add our user controller to our -login post route. So let's add our user controller create function, the one we created here, to our login post route. So first, let's import our user controller by using object deconstruction. So let's go into our routes, leave its login, and let's import our user controller. And now let's add our create function to this post route. And you can already see how much cleaner this looks as well, which is what I like about doing it this way. But so now, anytime a post request is made to -login, we will call our user.create function here. And so in other words, every time a post request is made to -login, if your username and password are present in the payload, that user will be added to our database. So now all we have to do is run our application and submit that form we made in a previous video. And I believe we are on localhost 1234. I think it's -login. Here's our login form. Let's also add a network tab so we can see this request in action. And I'm going to do username WittCode, password, subscribe. Let's send it off. We can see a post method here. We got WittCode's profile, which is the username passed in the body, which will be passed to, where is it? Our profile or our login. Sorry, which one was it? Profile.pug. So this is passed here, which comes from this create method because it renders this profile pug and passes in the username that the user entered. And now for the real important part, let's go into this. Make sure we double click the right database so it's bolded. Let's do select all from, I'm used to Postgres, so I was going to use comments, but to from user, might actually have to, sorry, from user, like this. And you can see what we have now is WittCode, subscribe, the CreatedAt, and the UpdatedAt stamps as well, and the ID. So we've connected officially to a database. Let's do another user. Let's do -login again. And now let's do Bruce. Password is wittcode.com. Send off this request. If we look at our post method, we could look at the payload. We have username, password. This is, of course, another reason why you'd want to encrypt, because you wouldn't want your password visible in the open like this. But anyway, if we go back into here, we select all from user again. Now we have Bruce, password, wittcode.com. So we've officially connected, and this is Bruce's profile. So we've officially connected our Sequelize, or our Express application to Sequelize. But so that's all there really was to this video. In the next one, I believe we're going to start learning about cookies. So be on the lookout for that if you're interested. But besides that, I just want to thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Besides that, I'd like to thank you for liking, subscribing today, and I hope to see you in the next video. Have a good one.